Thank you, choir, for that beautiful selection. By the way, can we say thank you to Jenny? Jenny's been filling in today. Kent's had to be out of town, so she's filled in for us today on piano. Thank you, Bill, for bringing that wonderful word this morning to us as well. And thank you, Lily, and your family for making a beautiful service already with baptism this morning. Well, good morning, church. It's great to be here with all of you this morning. This week we continue our Faces of Jesus series. You know, Kevin took us the first week into looking at the idea that possibly, Jesus was possibly a bit of a rebel, and do we need to be a bit of a rebel sometimes? And then last week, Matthew looked at Jesus as a teacher or a rabbi. And so this week, with the text selected, we're going to be looking at this idea of Jesus as mystic. But let us read our passage of Scripture this morning as we get into this. This is from Acts chapter 17, verses 22 through 28. Then Paul stood in front of the Areopagus and said, "Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. For as I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them an altar with an inscription, 'To an unknown God.' What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you, the God who made the world and everything in it. He who is Lord of heaven and earth does not live in shrines made by human hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. From one ancestor he made all nations to inhabit the whole earth, and he allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so that they would search for God and perhaps grope for him and find him, though indeed he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we too are his offspring." So as I mentioned, today we're going to look at this idea as Jesus as mystic. And if you're an unapologetic Marvel fan like me, you might, when you think of mystic, you might be thinking Doctor Strange, with Eye Amato and Master of the Mystic Arts. And if some of you guys are now looking at me like, what is Seth doing with his hands? Because you're not Marvel fans, have no fear. As cool as it would be to go down the road and maybe equate Doctor Strange, mystical teacher, with Jesus as mystic, that's not today's sermon. But we're going to be looking at this idea of mystic. And the other thing is, we read this passage, you might be wondering, is, okay, Seth, if this is a sermon about Jesus, then how come Jesus was not even in the scripture passage you just read? Why are we looking at Paul? You see, I think we can learn a lot about a leader from those who choose to follow the leader. So the reason I chose this passage in Acts today, that's not necessarily a gospel passage, is because I wanted to spend a little time reflecting on one of these early followers of Jesus. And so today we're looking at a passage about Paul. Now, Paul wasn't one of the first disciples, but Paul very quickly in Acts has this encounter on the Damascus Road with Jesus, and all of a sudden, Paul becomes a very big advocate for Jesus. Paul becomes a very big advocate for the church. And so Paul starts going around the Mediterranean world, and that's where today's scripture passage then comes in. Paul's been making journeys around the Mediterranean world, and he's now coming to Greece, and next up is the city of Athens. And the thing about Athens, though, is we have to kind of keep in context here, is that Athens is not just some backwater city in ancient Mediterranean sea and world and life back then. Athens is home to some of civilization's greatest minds. Athens is where Socrates would call home, and Plato. Some of the philosophers that, if you ever had to go through a Western Civilization 101 course, I'm sure you probably read it. And if you weren't really a philosophy major, you were probably like, oh man, why do we have to read this? But these are some of your earliest minds that are still taught today in college classrooms, considered fathers of modern philosophy or Western philosophy. This is the home. You have Stoic philosophers, and so this is a town Paul is coming to that has a rich history. It has a rich culture. After all, we think Socrates and Plato lived about in between 4 and 300 BC, so this is even before Christ. And so Athens and the people of Athens have been discussing what makes a meaningful life. How do we live a moral life for a long time, long before Paul comes here? And so Paul comes to Athens into a totally new culture. Have you ever been in Paul's shoes? Have you ever entered into a place that just felt totally so different from who you are? You ever feel anxious in those moments? You see, as we come into today's scripture, a theologian, I think he puts the questions well that really are at the heart of the scripture. Theologian Willie James Jennings writes, "What do you say to those radically outside yourself, radically different from you? What do you say to those radically outside yourself, outside your theological, or in other words, your understanding of God? What do you say to them when you have those encounters?" Maybe some of you guys have had the opportunity to travel to other countries and had an experience where you all of a sudden were the minority and completely different. How do we handle those responses? Because you see, I think Paul's got a really interesting response about how he engaged this here in Athens in Greece. If you read before this, you find out when Paul first gets to Athens, pretty typical normal human response. Since he's out of his normal element, he's anxious. He's going around, he's seeing all these different idols. Paul becomes distressed, and it's at this point then that Paul gets distressed. He starts arguing with some of the synagogue leaders that were in Athens. And then before that, here comes some Stoic philosophers that Paul starts debating with. And before long, they all say, you know what, we need to go to the Areopagus, which we have a picture of. If you ever have the opportunity to go to Greece, this is the rock formation that the Areopagus was built on. And there's actually a plaque along the stairs there that actually has all of Paul's speech to the Athenians here at the Areopagus. And so this is literally a place you can go to today. And so this is where Paul is then brought at this moment to share a word in a culture that he's somewhat maybe familiar with, but this is still totally different to him. He grew up on the eastern side of the Mediterranean world. And so what I find really fascinating is where Paul starts his speech then here on the Areopagus. Paul doesn't just come right out and say, you know what? I've seen all your idols, I've seen all this, and it's all wrong. You guys got it all wrong. He doesn't try and point out, oh man, this is so different. You guys have missed the boat. Let me tell you about the real God that's out there, not the ones that you have all these idols to in this city. Paul doesn't start there. What's really fascinating is we find out that apparently Paul's been doing a little more than just getting in debates with synagogue leaders and philosophers before this. Because Paul starts out his speech and he says, you know, I've taken some time. I've slowed down. I've walked through your city. I've noticed the different temples you have. I've probably walked inside some of these temples because you know what I discovered is I discovered you have this temple here to an unknown God. And here's where Paul then takes another step. He says, let me tell you about this unknown God you've been worshiping at this altar. I know something about this unknown God. Let me tell you more about that God. You see, Paul tries to build a connection. He took some time to slow down and see what was going on around. And so then Paul continues on his speech, and I'll be honest, I stopped today's scripture in the middle of his speech, which might seem like a really weird place to stop, but I feel like so often in the Christian world, we just jump to the resurrection. We jump to Jesus and resurrection, And I'll be honest, there's sometimes when I see social media posts by different Christians, it's just like that's all we seem to know about Jesus, is that Jesus is the resurrection. And so I feel like we would jump to the second half of Paul's message here and totally miss out some really important things that Paul's saying here at the beginning of the speech. Because Paul doesn't start out saying they're wrong. And Paul doesn't say, hey, have you wondered where God's at? Have you always looked to the skies and wondered where galaxy God is out there? God's actually not that far away. Paul makes some really profound theological statements here because all of a sudden Paul says, God is not as far away as we think. That we're actually way closer to God than we realize. Because it's in the presence of God that we move. It's in the presence of God that we live. It's in the presence of God that we have our being. In other words, Paul is telling them that God is right here, right now. You see, he didn't need to introduce God into Athens because God has already been at work since the beginning of creation. It wasn't a question of him introducing them to God. It was pointing to where he see God moving in their midst and having their being. And this is where Paul takes this direction and says, let me tell you about your unknown God in this altar. And mystics are like that. Mystics seem to not start with the differences. Mystics seem to find the connections of how, even though maybe we appear to be so different from one another, we actually do have some connections. Mystics often, if you read them throughout history, reveal to us a God that is not found somewhere out in the great beyond of the universe. Mystics often talk about how you can find God inside of you, and that how God can be found here, and God can be found here. And God can be found over here. Or if you want to know where God's presence is, it's right here. It's not outside somewhere. But God's inside each one of us every day. And so mystics often encourage us to start from a different place. Rather than start with what we know in faith and certainty, mystics often seem to take the opposite direction. That mystics seem to suggest that, there's no way you can find enough words in all of the languages of the world to fully describe God. Mystics often say that, there's no image that can perfectly capture who God is. That God is way too big to be contained in our words or images, and that God's love is way too deep to be simply defined by what we can understand. And I think when I think of Jesus, I often think of him as a mystic, because it seems like multiple times throughout Jesus' ministry, this is what he does. You see, Jesus gets baptized in the Jordan by John. The heavens open. There's this moment. Talking about baptism today, there's Jesus' baptism. And then he doesn't start the ministry. Yeah, I can't sing the choir, huh? I'm sure some of you out there are like, man, he's off pitch. He's off tune. But so Jesus has this momentum coming out of his baptism, and you would think, oh man, he's going to launch his ministry. He's got the excitement. Everybody's on board. They've seen this at the Jordan River. They're going to want to go. And Jesus does the complete opposite. Jesus is like, all right, see ya. I'm going to go spend some time out in the wilderness by myself. Because I need to spend some more time reflecting on how God's moving in my life. How many times does Jesus walk into towns and neighborhoods and the stories, and he starts teaching, and he starts sharing wisdom, and before long, people are bringing people to him to be healed, and the town's excited, and they're staying up late just celebrating the healings in their midst, and all of a sudden, the disciples wake up the next morning, and Jesus is gone. He's left. As great and as busy and as wonderful as all that was, Jesus then took time step back, to pause. And how many times did Jesus build connections where often we want to point out our differences? Jesus talked to Roman centurions. He talked to synagogue leaders. Jesus talked to hated Samaritans. And Jesus even sat at the well with just one other woman. Such a scandal. And yet, that was Jesus constantly trying to build connections between divided groups. And so this is what Paul is leaning into as he steps into Athens and he shares this story about the God of your unknown God and altar. And I'll be honest, I can really relate to the story because in 2016 I had this amazing opportunity. Dr. Molly Marshall, the president of Central Seminary, where Matthew and I graduated from, she asked me if I would be her teacher's assistant because Central has a partnership with Myanmar Theological Institute. And Beth and I talked about it, and I said, great, yeah, that truly is a privilege and honor. I'd love to go with you. And so for 10 days, I went to Myanmar. And if you're like, I have no idea where Myanmar is, it's okay. I had to look up on a map too. But it's also known as Burma. It's over by Thailand, bordered by India, bordered by China. And so we went to Myanmar for 10 days. Now, just to let you know a little bit about Myanmar, it's also predominantly a Buddhist culture. Buddhist is predominant. And so as far as being in a place where I felt completely different, there's nowhere else I could think of in the world at that point. I didn't know the language. And funny thing is I got separated from our team. I entered Myanmar late at night by myself because I got held up in the airport, flagged by security. And so I was totally thrown into the country. Not knowing anything, just hoping this taxi in the middle of the night was taking me to the right hotel. And one of the days while we were in Myanmar, I got the opportunity to go visit the shrine in Yangon. It's called a Shraden Pagoda. And it's truly magnificent. And this picture doesn't quite do justice. As we climbed up the steps that night, we visited in the evening. The sun's rays were just hitting that gold, and it was just reflecting the light everywhere. And it just gave the place this sense of glow and serenity that's really kind of hard to capture in that picture. And so here I was visiting this Buddhist temple, the shrine, and I started noticing not a whole lot of differences, but a lot of similarities. I was asked to take off my shoes because this was a sacred holy spot. Very similar to how Moses was suggested to take off his sandals because he was in the presence of God. As I looked at the people at this pagoda that were praying and meditating, I couldn't help but notice it looked really familiar and really similar to how I've tried to find quiet places to pray and to meditate. And so I stayed there well after dark that evening, just taking it all in. And I gotta be honest, as I walked down those stairs that night, I couldn't help but feel like I had encountered the sacred in that place, in that moment. Like Paul identifying this altar to an unknown God, I felt like I was in the presence that's been moving throughout all of creation. Not just here in my life. I'm not saying we're exactly the same, but so often it seems like in our society we want to point out how we're different from one another. But as I walked home that night and took the taxi back to the hotel, I couldn't think about how many similarities we shared. See, that's what mystics are like. And I don't know about you, but I need more mystics in my life. People to remind me to slow down, to stop, to pay attention to what's going on around, and see how maybe there's much more we have in common than we really have apart. Paul was doing it in Athens, and many have found it a way to encounter the divine since. And it's not just about building connections with others. You see, I think even mystics invite us to help us realize that maybe we're holding on to things that we don't need to. Because I want to close with this last story. You see, shortly after I graduated from seminary, I took the first full-time job as associate pastor at Lewisburg, and things were great. Beth was getting to go back to school for what she wanted to do. I got another phone call then, after I'd started there for a few weeks. I got a call from my college alma mater, Ottawa University, asking if I would be willing to come on as an adjunct instructor part-time and teach some college courses because they need some in faith and religion. And the program had known that I had a desire someday to do a PhD, and so they knew my work from my days in my undergrad and asked if I would be an instructor. And I thought, you know what? This is it. I've made it. I got a full-time job, an associate pastor. I'm providing for my family, and now I get to even have my dream even more full because here I get to teach at the college level, and I haven't even gone on for a PhD yet. And it's like, I thought it was amazing, and it was awesome. And I started this out, and we talked about it, and we decided it would work out for us because, you know, with Beth in school, what better way to bring in some more income than teach a couple courses? And so I started out full-time pastor and part-time adjunct instructor at Ottawa University, and things were going along great until I got to my son's 5th birthday. You see, my oldest son, it was coming up to his 5th birthday, and he wanted a bicycle. And so we got him his first bicycle for his 5th birthday. And I'm thinking, no big deal, it's great, I'm glad I can provide. And so we're out there with family celebrating. We go down to the parking lot for him to try out his brand new bicycle. And there he goes, he sits on top of it, and he just takes off into the parking lot. And my heart just sinks. Because not that I'm not excited and happy that he's going into a bigger role, but my heart sunk that day because I realized I had no idea how my son even got to this point. I still imagine my son in my arms, holding him, or just picking him up on one side, playing rumble tumble as a 2 and 3-year-old. How did my son get to be 5? And I realized that this dream I was chasing of both working full-time as associate pastor and teaching part-time as adjunct instructor was robbing me of something that I thought was more important to me, but clearly I hadn't given it the time, was making memories with my kids. See, sometimes we need mystics in our lives to remind us that not everything we're doing to be busy in our world is what matters. Sometimes we need to pay attention to those altars and what's going on to remind us what's important. And so as we close today, I want to ask, what about you? What pace are you moving at? And more importantly, do you have any time in your life to stop, to ask questions, to know that God is not just on the move somewhere out there in the universe, but God is on the move right here, right now, inside each and every one of you?